Alright then, so we've seen an awful lot of the stuff here in Lightwave. We've seen the basic inner workings of Lightwave itself, how it handles all of the different things as pertain to rigging. We've seen an overview of the tools that are available, and we've taken a look at some of the basic theory and good rigging practices. To wrap up this chapter, I want to take a look at some of the common problems or common mistakes that you often see in rigs, as being aware of them will help you to avoid them when building your own. As I say, many of these are very common, and the reason is because they are often easily missed. One of the best ways to avoid them is to always be thorough in the checking of your rig and always thinking your way through it. In demonstrating a lot of these points, we're going to pick apart some of the rigs that are on the 11.5 content set, because many of the common errors that we see crop up throughout those rigs. It also of course means that if you want to check them out for yourself, explore further, they're ready and available for you to get your hands on. So let's dive straight in and take a look at some of these little nuances. First of all, this guy, we have the Octopus setup here, who somewhat unusually only has 6 arms, but never mind. What I want to show with this guy is a common problem which we can think of as over-engineering of a setup. Now, we've got a bit of a rig in this guy, and all of these different controllers that control his limbs and various parts. Moving around, there we go. But there's no kind of IK or other controllers of this nature for him. He's largely just an FK structure, where of course you would select the controllers thusly and whip his little tentacles around in this fashion. So no, octopuses don't have tentacles, they have arms. Anyway, what we do notice with this fellow is that his interactivity speed is quite slow. He's kind of sluggish in terms of his performance in the viewport. If we just hit play, we can see how the timer chugs along there really quite slowly. The reason for this is the fact that we have these little null objects bound to every single bone in the rig. Therefore, each and every bone has constraints set up for both position and rotation to the null which represents its place in the hierarchy. This is over-engineered because, of course, every bone being constrained to each null has to be computed. All of these relationships and constraints have to be calculated, which of course takes up time. Since we have no IK here, of course he could be used with IK boost, say, but since we have no IK here, then all that these additional constraints do is just get in the way. They add computation time that's not needed and thus slow down our rig. It would be far better if none of these constraints existed and you were to just animate the bones directly themselves, whether that be via FK or IKB, whatever else. It can often be tempting or seem like a nice idea to go putting these handy little control nulls on things with nice shapes or colours or whatnot. But if it's going to affect the interactivity and speed and performance of a rig, then it's clearly a bad idea. Style over substance or over performance is not a trade that you should make. Moving right along then, we'll take a look at this fella, the mannequin rig. The first thing I'm going to focus on is the main root pivot, what many people often refer to as the centre of gravity, although in articulated characters of this nature or anything that changes shape, centre of gravity is a bit of a fallacy. As a little side pointer here, if you want to have a bit of a more detailed look at theories and ideas surrounding character roots, come and have a check of this video here on my YouTube channel, which discusses a number of issues and ideas and techniques. Otherwise, getting back here, what we can see is that his root control, which is manipulated via this null, operates this bone here, the pivot point of which is over here, external to the character. This is a mistake I've seen a great many people make over the years, and it is completely wrong. In characters like this, whether they're biped, quadruped, whatever else, you do not want the central root pivot point external to the character. When we bend ourselves, if we're bending at the hip, we don't rotate from somewhere behind our backs. We rotate from between our hips. Now this goes back slightly to what we were saying in the last video about flexibility of design choices and how certain things can be a matter of taste or a project by project kind of detail. In this case, all you have to do is pop onto YouTube and type in rigging reel and just pick out any of the character rigs that you like and look them over and see how many people put the central root pivot point external to the character. nobody does it. The reason why is that it's incorrect. As it happens in this case with Genoma, this is a really easy fix, although we will come on to further Genoma fixes later. This is such a basic one, I'll show you it now. Simply grab that point that it will be the pivot point and just move it inside the character in modeler like this. Otherwise, there we go. There's that first little note. Watch your roots. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Well, we have IK for the arms, which is fine. It all works fine. Specific to this guy's IK setup, let's take a look at the wrist hierarchy that we have here. We have, of course, the main IK goal controller there, and we have this little sub-controller, which is for rotation. This is an offset item, as we saw in the previous video, and that's all grand. However, notice that our main IK goal here, which also, of course, does rotate our hand, is oriented on the world axis. When you have a controller for an item, a hand, a finger, whatever, it is always far better to orient that controller to match the orientation of the part itself. For instance, I want to twist the wrist around itself. Pronation. That's no problem. I can do it, of course, here using the pitch axis. But look what happens. Because the controller is not oriented along with the hand, when you do it, the hand winds up turned up at an angle. If we were just wanting straight round motion around the axis of the forearm, we've got to come and secondarily animate it back down again. This means you've got a crossover of axis when performing the motion, which have to be handled in your graphs and everything else. Animators will not like this. It gets in the way of workflow. Also, of course, notice that because of the orientation of this item here, when we do come round like that, we have achieved gimbal lock. This will be more obvious if I switch here to bounding box mode for you. You see? We have no axis to turn it back down even if we wanted to. We would have to use this secondary controller, which to a certain extent is all well and good. That's why we have these nested offset secondary controllers to help us out when we get in gimbal lock. But having it achieved so quickly and readily is not a good thing, and it could have been prevented by having better orientation matching between your controller and your actual part, in this case, the hand geometry. Notice also that this secondary rotation controller is better aligned to the hand, still not quite perfect. It could be twisted a little bit more. The heading axis there isn't quite in line with the plane of the palm. But whilst that's a step better, the orientation of this controller is completely different from this one. Here the heading is on the flat, the pitch is around, the bank is up and down, whereas on this one the heading is up and down, the bank is around, and the pitch is running against the flat in the plane of the palm. When you have these nested hierarchies of offset controllers, it is always better to match their orientations to one another. It makes things much cleaner for an animator. If you're doing a certain action, a flap of the hand, and that happens to be on the heading for one controller, and then at some point he either desires or needs to use the other controller, and all of a sudden it's on the bank, then that's only going to confuse things. You come into Graph Editor and you go to adjust the heading, but oh no, it's not the heading because I'm on the other controller, I've got to use the bank on this controller. It just becomes a bit of a nightmare when you're working. There's something else that we can see here in this setup. We notice, of course, that when we rotate the hand like this, when we pronate it, obviously the rotation of the bones in the forearm here is updating. This whole system is cross-linked, which is lovely and clever. However, we also have this secondary FK controller here that lets us operate the hand, and we notice that when that is twisted or pronated, the forearm does not respond. Therefore, the system is incomplete. It essentially means that on this character, there is an axis of control available on the hand that is useless to us. We can't use it because it doesn't give us the correct response in other parts of the rig. It's not all hooked up properly. We can also notice that this controller and its axial alignment is also out of sync with the axial alignment of the hand geometry itself. So once again, we've got offset axis problems there. We have another little thing in here. You'll notice that if we come round on the heading here, swinging the hand side to side, the forearm still rotates, which of course it ought not. Hold your hand out in front of yourself and push your palm side to side laterally like that. Your forearm does not rotate, and it ought not. The reason for it is twofold. One, it's these mismatched orientations of the controllers themselves, but also it's the underlying mismatched spatial orientations, as we saw in the rotations and orientations video, of the bones themselves that are doing the actual deformation, and how they coincide and reference one another. These sort of mistakes are easy to make when you're building your rig, because you set stuff up like this and you give it a bit of a manipulation and you play around and say, yeah, look at that, that's all good, and it seems fine on the surface. But if you get into using it a bit more, and you try this and you try that, and certainly you try animating a few things, suddenly the problems become more obvious. As you get used to seeing these sort of things, it will be easier to avoid them from the get-go as you're building things from scratch. Something else worth noting at this point is that these problems can be further exacerbated depending on your choice of base orientations for things, and of course how you line them all up. Here I've got a version of the mannequin which has been prepped in the palms forward base pose as opposed to the palms down base pose. Notice what happens here when we perform this same rotation on heading here, this time to flap the hand in and out. We notice that during the flapping action the forearm rotates, which of course if you flap your own palm in this manner is clearly incorrect. So there's that. We also have another problem in this forearm setup. Notice that if I rotate the forearm here and I create a key for it, then I move through time here and everything is just fine, no problem. However, we have to consider the keying style. Notice that when I create my keyframe, I'm creating a key just for the selected item. One way in which some people like to animate is just to key everything. It's a personal choice on the part of the animator. Some animators just like to key all of their controls, all of their items, to create actual, what might be considered traditional keyframes. But notice what happens if I key all items with the hand and forearm rotated thus. Immediately, nothing. But as soon as I skip a frame, notice the forearm jump there, up here. Let me key all items again. Move frame, jumps again. Key all items again, jumps again. And this jump will compound as I keep keying all items, keying all items, keying all items. We see that it gets less and less each time, but it builds up, and then the forearm pretty much stops working properly, and we wind up with this fixed, compounded jump in our rotations. In this particular case, it has to do with how these bones have been set up to follow the rotation of the hand. It's a mishandling of the evaluation in the constraint. Of course, the solution to this is to not key all items, just to key selected items when working. But you have to consider how the rig might be used by an animator. Is it better to give them a rig that has these specific instructions, you can only use key selected items, or do you want to build a rig that's free so an animator can key it this way, key it that way, operate it this way, operate it that way, and have it work, irrespective of the kind of control choices that the animator chooses to make? So, how about a little something else when it comes to animation? Let's just put the arm into a pose here, and we're going to use the pole item there to swing the upper arm in this fashion, rotates our upper arm. Now on this character, because he's sort of this ball and socket skeletal style character, it's not such a big issue. Generally you're wanting this entire arm piece to rotate, but notice that it is rotating in the shoulder socket. If this were a smooth skinned character, a continuous skin, you wouldn't want this because of course you would just be getting a twist here, and the geometry would become quite ugly. Now, in this fellow, we have a secondary controller here that lets us twist the upper half of the upper arm, which is great. You can smooth out your deformations and correct for that. Wonderful little thing, handy little controller, right? But again, consider the process of animation. What this means is that every time I want to animate the upper arm turning, I've doubled my workload because I have to animate both this item here to control the overall rotation of the arm, and then I have to go and animate this controller here to correct for deformation. Character animation is a laborious and long-winded process enough. Doubling the workload on animating certain parts is not a good way to do any animator a favour. We can notice these exact same problems, by the way, if you want to take a peek for yourself. I won't laboriously go through them, but they do also exist in the leg structure, since effectively the setup of these legs is identical to the arms. This twist structure in the lower leg here has the same problems. For instance, we can notice if we tip the foot too far forward, see the lower leg there just twists round and inverts itself, little things like that. And also the correction here for the twist of the upper leg, because this guy has these femur style bones for his upper leg, then trying to correct the deformation there in this case just bends and breaks the geometry. This isn't so much set up wrong, it's just set up wrong for this character. And what it does is to illustrate again the point that was made in the last video, that whilst you can come up with clever designs of rig structures that work for a great many characters, there will never be one rig to rule them all, and you do have to design your rig and deformation systems sometimes on a character by character basis, taking specific care and attention to the exact shape and proportion of the character mesh. I'm going to grab the head controller now. There's nothing particularly interesting about the head here, but there is one aspect worthy of note, which is very much a Lightwave specific sort of thing. Notice that when I rotate the head, we're getting deformation in the chest here. Watch carefully around here, just up by the edge of where the collarbone would be. You see? There is this deformation fall off. Lightwave's weighting and skinning system is pretty unique to Lightwave. It's not something that you see in other packages such as Maya, and it can make skinning very easy and very quick to do. It's a great little system. The problem that arises from this ease and speed, however, is the fact that it's easy to miss things, get careless, get a bit sloppy, and wind up with these deformations going on in areas where they should not be happening. We can notice another little instance of this in this rig if we operate the shoulder or collar here. We notice that as we come forward with it, the shoulder socket there completely disjoins from the whole thing and penetrates through the mesh, which clearly means that that pose is effectively unavailable to us. Again, reason why is simply that the weighting has been taken a little bit too loosely. We'll take now a look at this fellow, the Rasper Cow. Quite a complex rig. He's got loads of little bits and pieces going on in here. Quite notably, of course, these tendons here that operate these stretchy tendonite bits on the legs. Stretchy bones and bits and pieces going on there. It's all nice and pretty, but watch what happens when we raise the leg up. Look here at this stretchy tendon. I'll zoom in on it a bit more so it's a bit more obvious here. We see that when we come up, get to a point and the mesh inverts. The bone is spinning basically, the bone is flipping, causing our mesh there to do an inversion. As we see, it gives us this quite ugly and unrealistic deformation there that only corrects when the bone is able to pull back out. Again, this is a problem of space and orientation, primarily gimbal lock on the bone. It has nowhere to go, and so it flips. And we can see another similar thing here in the lower leg portion of this quadruped leg. If we tip it too far forward, once again, the whole thing just flips and the mesh inverts. Very much similar to the hand-forearm problem we saw in the other rig there. The continuity of orientation between the bones here, the bones in the foot. Here's another interesting little thing. We have these pole items here that control the roll of this part of the leg. Okay, that's all nice and good, and as we move it side to side, the bit of leg itself pitches side to side. Bit of weird deformation, but that's not too big a deal. The interesting and unusual thing to take note of is that when this pole is moved up and down in line with the piece of limb, it still rotates, something that you ordinarily would not expect. What this means, of course, is first, during animation, you've got to keep a good handle on this thing and keep making sure that you're correcting it right so as it's not causing an unwanted twist. And with a little thing like this that's just slightly incorrect, it's very easy to just think, well, you know what, it's close enough, never mind about this strange minor bug that's going on. The problem with rigs is that they have lots of interconnected parts and interconnected systems, and all of these controllers are going to be moved around and doing stuff. So if this is a bit off, and then of course we come along and we start doing something else elsewhere, oh dear, look at what has happened. Our leg has just completely turned to mulch, and it's fallen apart completely. So whilst you might have a tiny adder on one controller and a tiny adder on another controller, it's incredibly important to see what happens when these tiny adders overlap and collide with one another. You can get complete and absolute breaks. The real lesson to take note of is pay attention to the details, every last little one. This is one of the things that makes rigging partly so very exciting and so very much fun to do, at least if you're me, but also so very challenging and so very difficult in a way, because there is so much that you have to follow through on and pay attention to and so on. So there we have it, a basic little roundup of some of the most common problems that can be experienced when you are building your rigs. And of course, as we go through this training, we shall see these things come up. We'll see how to correct for them, how to get them right the first time, where exactly all of these issues stem from, and everything else. And of course, this is why all of these bits and pieces that we were going through beforehand about space, about orientations, hierarchies, evaluation orders, it is why they are so important and why you have to know them back to front and inside out, because these are the fundamental mechanics that you build your rig upon. And it is always, always, always because you miss little tricks or little facts about those mechanics that you will wind up with problems in your rigs. And of course, if you don't understand those underlying systems, trying to fix those problems essentially just becomes an exercise in trial and error. Let's try it this way, let's click that, let's change this controller, and that will make your rigging just take forever. And that's not a good thing, especially when you're trying to build more highly functioning or complex rigs. Finally, I want to return to looking at another hand setup here to demonstrate the greatest problem of all. Getting things to work functionally so that all of the, setup is done correctly is fine, and that's well and good. And obviously there are errors and mistakes to be avoided. But even if you get all of that right, you're not completely out of the woods. That is what this little setup here will demonstrate nicely for us. So, what do we see? Well, we've got, good old FK going on here, just as we've seen before on hands. We also have an IK switch for the fingers that allows us to use them in IK mode like this, which is, wonderful. Little IK posing for fingers, very nice and handy. We also have this multi-controller that lets us operate the entire hand just off of a single control in this fashion, taking care of all of the different actions for splay and the cupping actions of fingers and everything else. Furthermore, this also operates within the FK rotations, so as you can offset a single digit or knuckle or whatever else in FK, and that will run in with the rest of the system. It's an incredibly versatile and highly functioning hand rig. And in a sense, there's nothing wrong with it functionally. It doesn't break, it doesn't have any errors, it doesn't misbehave if this control is there and another control is elsewhere. It functions perfectly. But, hierarchically speaking, it's a nightmare. We have all these different forms of hierarchies for the fingers, each providing all of these different functions, all of the different hierarchies for each finger cross-constraining and blending between one another. And whilst it delivers up a wonderfully functional rig, all we have to do is hit play to see that it's dog slow. I mean, it could be a lot worse. You're getting about 10 frames a second out of this character as a whole. But most of the slowdown is coming from this complicated hand setup. And this really is the biggest challenge of all, building setups that are not only functionally correct, so to speak, but which also deliver efficiency, flexibility for the animator, and so on, but without overloading the whole thing. This particular hand setup comes from my Rigit tool set. It's part of the advanced biped template. And wonderful and all singing and all dancing as it is, I do kind of hate it, because it is such a heavy, heavy beast. Could it be designed better, more efficiently, use different ways of doing the different functions that it has? It probably could be. The honest truth is that I haven't given this further and further and further enough development to be able to iron out all of these little things and get more and more performance. Although I am convinced it could be done. And you yourselves might find it a handy little exercise to try as you get more familiar with rigging. The most important thing that I want you to take away from this example, and those that we've already just seen, is that there are two tiers to the most common problems you will face in rigging. The first thing to understand and get right is technically correct rigs that work, that function without misbehaviors or breakages and so on, whilst the second is efficiency of design, finding new and innovative ways of setting up systems and control methods that deliver the kind of function that you're needing on a given character, given scene, given animation, whilst continuing, of course, to always explore and try new things and ask yourself repeatedly, could this be done better? And with that, that pretty much concludes this opening chapter into RH Rigging 2. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned a lot. And I shall see you again in the next chapter as we explore in depth all of the specific tools and techniques.